My name's Tom Fleischner. I know many, but certainly not all of you. I'm the Executive Director of the Natural History Institute based here in Prescott, Arizona, currently under 2 to 3 feet of snow. And we are delighted to be hosting this event tonight. I'll say a little bit more about that. And I get to have the pleasure of being the host. I'll be introducing how we're going to do this and then get to introduce our guest of honor here momentarily. The Natural History Institute is a mission-based independent nonprofit organization based here in the Mogollon Highlands ecoregion of Arizona. And the mission, I say it's mission driven. Our mission is to provide leadership and resources for a revitalized practice of natural history that integrates art, science, and humanities to promote the health and well-being of humans and the rest of nature. Simply put, we try to foster love and understanding of the world, and we believe that paying attention to nature matters and matters deeply, and that there's many different valid ways of paying that attention through art, through science, and everything in between. I would welcome you who are new to our programs to the Institute. I encourage you to check out our website, which is just naturalhistoryinstitute.org. There's all sorts of resources there, information on upcoming programs. Our next online program is 3 weeks from tonight on poetry in the wild with the wonderful poet Jane Hirschfield, for example. Also, you will see there a link to our Natural History Institute YouTube channel, which has all sorts of wonderful programs archived, including programs like this, but also a whole video series called Notes from the Field that my colleague Bob Ellis, who you see statically at the bottom, has been putting together. Bob tonight is our sort of behind the scenes tech master. Thank you, Bob. Also want to bring your attention on there. There's something we've started this year during the COVID times called the Real Ground Project, which is an invitation to share writings and art of sort of bearing witness in this time. Would encourage some of you to consider submitting things to us. And also, like all small nonprofits, we are dependent on the generosity and support of the people we serve. So we invite your support as well. Again, welcome to the Institute. Also want to acknowledge we have 2 great co-sponsoring organizations tonight. First, the Peregrine Book Company, which is our friend and ally right around the corner from our office, a great independent bookstore based here in Prescott, Arizona. They have Mitch's books available, and they can ship anywhere. Their website is peregrinebookcompany.com, and I'll just say also their phone number, if you want to get in touch, is 928-445-9000. That's 928-445-9000. So if you Peregrine, we love working with you. And also MIT Press, the publisher of all of Mitch's books, including the one we're going to be talking about tonight, is also a co-sponsor of tonight's event. So thank you, MIT Press. So a couple things about how we're going to be doing things here. As I already mentioned, we will be disabling the chat function. We just find it's distracting, and we can focus more if we are sort of all together in the mode. But we do use the Q&A function, the question and answer function, which is you'll find on the lower the bar at the bottom of the page or the bottom of your screen. And you can anytime while Mitch is talking, you can start. If you have a question or a comment, you can start adding them there, and then I'll be sort of facilitating that part of the program when we are feeding him questions and answers, because that's obviously one of the most exciting and important parts of this event. Also, in that Q&A function, there's a thumbs up function where if somebody else has said basically what you want to say, you don't have to write it all over again. You just give the thumbs up, and then we know that that's a question of a special concern. And also I wanted to let you know that this is also simultaneously live streaming on YouTube, and this will be archived on our YouTube channel, which, by the way, you can subscribe to. And that about 24 hours from now, it'll be up there all ready to go. So if there's somebody that you really would like to share this with, then that will be easy to do. Okay, so It's my pleasure to introduce our guest of honor tonight and my good friend, Mitch Thomashow, who obviously his fame precedes him. Mitch has for many, many years been on the front lines of sort of innovative and interdisciplinary ecological thought and ecological education. And among Mitch's extensive experience and positions, two things jump out. One is for many, many years, he was the chair of environmental studies at the Antioch, New England Graduate School in Keene, New Hampshire, and mentored a great many people and influenced a lot of us, I think, from the work he was doing there. And then from Antioch, New England, he went to Unity College in Maine, where he served as the president for several years. And through all this, was deeply involved in movements towards sustainability within academia again. And so Mitch is also the author of several books, all of them published by MIT Press. Ecological Identity, Becoming a Reflective Environmentalist, Bringing the Biosphere Home, Learning to Perceive Global Environmental Change, The 9 Elements of a Sustainable Campus, and then, of course, the book that just came out recently that we're here to talk about tonight, To Know the World, A New Vision for Environmental Learning. I'm also happy to say that Mitch is a member of the National Advisory Council of the Natural History Institute. So thank you for that, Mitch. And the way this is going to work is just momentarily, I'll be turning this over to Mitch, who's going to make some introductory comments, and then we'll make a presentation with slides and so on that will take roughly a half an hour or so. And then we will open it up to question and answer and discussion. So welcome, Mitch. Thank you for joining us here tonight. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And I will turn it over to you, Mitch.
Okay, let me do a screen share first, and we'll get launched. Okay, so we need to do play. All right, we did it. Well, Tom, thanks for having me, and thank you for the phenomenal work that you've done at the Natural History Institute. Tom is a longtime faculty member at Prescott College, and he had a dream, and the dream was to facilitate and amplify and project the importance of natural history education. And he did it by starting an institute with the help of lots of friends and donors, and a terrific community that he's put together. So he's one of the rare people who, at a certain pretty late stage of life, decided to give up what was secure and start something brand new, and it's had a great impact. Tom's also just a terrific person, good musician, and a wonderful naturalist, and it's so great to be here with you. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. Those of you who've seen me speak before know that I cover a lot of ground very quickly. I hope my enthusiasm carries you forward with it. I'm going to take you through this whole book. I'm going to focus on certain aspects of it. I'm going to start by telling you a bit more about myself and my own work, and why this is in many respects the culmination of my long career in environmental studies. Then I'll tell you what is in the book. I'm going to focus on 2 chapters in much more depth, and we'll take it from there. So this is my 4th book. Each of these books came really out of my teaching and my experience. Ecological Identity, I wrote back in 1995. And the idea is that I was involved with many environmental studies students, and I was very curious as to why they chose to do this and what was it about their work that made them so interesting. And so the book was really about that. How do people change when they realize that the most important thing to them is their relationship with the natural world? The second book, Bringing the Biosphere Home, I was very concerned and interested in global environmental change, why it's so hard to perceive. This was back in the early 2000s. This came out in 2001. And the idea of bringing the biosphere home is that through intimate awareness of local natural history, you learn to expand your sense of space and time, and you can really see some of the big picture changes that happen on the planet. The third book, The 9 Elements of a Sustainable Campus, came out of my experience as the president of Unity College, where to rebrand and reconceptualize the college, we wanted to turn it into a sustainable campus. And then I visited many campuses around the country for several years. Gosh, I've probably been to 100 or more over the years. And this book really tells about my experience visiting these campuses and outlines a whole strategy for how you can move sustainability forward. And so finally is this new book, To Know the World. There are 9 chapters in the book. And what I want to say in relationship to the Natural History Institute is that the importance of understanding and perceiving natural history and gaining knowledge in that area is the backbone and foundation of everything that I've ever done. Even though I myself am not a great naturalist, I try to observe as well as I can. But it is the basis for all of this work, and it's the basis for this work as well. So I'm going to very briefly take you through all of these chapters. I'm going to spend more time in the middle of the book, and you'll see why when I get there. My view is that environmental studies is at a crossroads right now. That my generation and many people who you know and you're aware of, including Tom and David Orr and so many others, we built the field. When I was in college at NYU in the late 1960s, there wasn't a single environmental studies course. Now they have a flourishing environmental studies program. So over 30, 40 years, we built a field. And out of that field also came sustainability. And who would have thought back in 2000 that we now have sustainability coordinators at hundreds and hundreds of universities throughout North America. So there's been great progress that's been made. But one of my concerns is that when a field reaches a certain stature, it becomes self-satisfied. And environmental studies and sustainability as fields have always had to innovate. And so part of the driving inspiration for this book is exactly how does the environmental studies field need to innovate now to face a very challenging, difficult, and uncertain future. So that's the reason why I wrote this book. And I write it from the perspective, again, of an educator. And that's why I describe the concept of environmental learning. What does it mean to be an environmental learner? And by the way, I don't use the word environmental education because I think, unfortunately, it's been trivialized and stereotyped. So I hope to broaden the whole concept by changing the language just a little bit. And one more trip back into the past, and you'll see why in a moment. Way back in the 1960s, I was at NYU, which was in the Bronx, and every Friday I would take the subway down to Lower Manhattan to go to the 8th Street bookstore because there was no internet, of course, and I was really interested in all the movements. I was interested in the environmental movement and the peace movement and the civil rights movement. I wanted to read about all of these things, the women's movement. And so I'd always go to the bookstores to see what new books were on the shelves. And one day I saw this book, the Whole Earth Catalog. And to use the parlance of the time, I remember looking at it and going something like wow, what is that? I took the book off the shelf, and it was amazing for me to read this book. And in retrospect, the contents of this book became my curriculum for all the work that I've done throughout the years, trying to implement programs that reflected the spirit and the possibilities in the Whole Earth Catalog all those years ago. And this is the icon that drives all of that. And again, I'm showing you images that will reappear throughout the slideshow. The bottom line is this: learning how to perceive global environmental change is the crucial educational challenge of our times. It's so good to see the current administration bringing that to the foreground, by the way. The 4 big challenges that we face, as a quick review, are the 6th mega extinction. During the history of life on Earth, there have been 5 mega extinctions. We don't hear about this one as much. We're now in the early days of the 6th. The difference between this one and previous ones is that it's human caused. This is accompanied, of course, by plunging declines in biodiversity, rapidly changing atmospheric and oceanic circulations, which is how I describe climate change. Because the fact of the matter is all of these circulations are changing very rapidly, and we really don't understand what the consequences are going to be, but we know that the change is here and it's rapid. And finally, the biogeochemical imbalances that result from that. For example, you could have a drought in Central Africa, and the iron in the desert can be blown into the Pacific, into the Indian Ocean, and it will spawn a phytoplanktonic bloom. So all of these things are dramatically interconnected. We have to focus our attention on them. And it's not only to understand the challenges that we face as a planet, but also to maximize the beauty that we feel. I mean, this is a beautiful planet. There's so much to take in. It's so exciting to be alive at this moment of time, as challenging as it might be. So the issue, though, now is that environmental concerns are connected to these pertinent questions: economic opportunity, social justice, healthcare, racism, violent conflict, global poverty. But the connections between these issues and the ecological fate of the planet are not easily perceived. I think now, more than any time really in my lifetime, people are beginning to see these connections. But the question is, what is the role of environmental studies in making those connections more clear? And that's part of what I'll be covering in this talk. I describe the current situation as convergent tides of change, which is the third chapter in the book. And I go into each of these questions in quite a bit of detail, but for now, I just want to frame them for you. The first is condition one, that's the rapacious exploitation of the biosphere. And its systems, how do we best communicate the necessity of ecosystem thinking? The second is the increasing disparity between rich and poor. How do we promote economic equity and social justice in cultures of materialism and entitlement? The third is the apprehension concerning the integration and separation of global cultures. How do we promote intercultural understanding and cosmopolitan thinking in the midst of nationalist responses and ethnic chauvinism? And finally, fourth, violence, weapons, and terror compete with deliberation, diplomacy, and collaboration. How do we settle our differences through community democracy, compromise, and service in the midst of conflict, extreme behavior, and fear? If you look at what's happened in this country over the past few weeks, you can see all of these questions. It's absolutely incredible how they've come to the forefront of everything that we do. They underlie COVID. They underline the transition between regimes in Washington. These are the tides of change. And we've been dealing with these really all of our lives. So we saw the first seeds of this in the 60s, and they're all coming into the foreground now. So the challenge is that you can't deal with any one of them in isolation. For many years, condition one, that is the rapacious exploitation of the biosphere, questions of biodiversity, species extinction, and climate, people felt that they could deal with that without having to deal with the other ones, but that's not the case. Those issues are intimately tied up with questions of, let's say, what's often called climate justice. And similarly, if you're interested in democracy, condition four, or in issues of racism and cosmopolitan thinking in condition three, and then condition two, disparity between rich and poor. These are all connected. And if you're looking at those questions, you can't separate them from environmental issues. So the challenge of this chapter is to try to bring all of this together and demonstrate the importance of this through the trends that impact the future of environmental learning. And I want to quickly say what they are. We are rapidly becoming an urban planet. By 2050, 80% of the people on this planet will be living in cities. We are a global cosmopolitan culture, whether some people like that or not. The fact is there's tremendous exchange between places on the globe. That's why COVID spread so rapidly. We have to learn how to live with that. The third is the ecological equity and social justice issue will not go away. It will only get more intense as the egregious disparities become more clear. Fourth is that information networks bring new cognitive orientations in terms of how we perceive nature. I'll say more about that in a moment. And then fifth is the challenge of the relationship between openness and vigilance. On the one hand, we want to be as open as possible to new ideas and new possibilities. On the other hand, as we've learned recently, we have to be constantly vigilant. Not only in terms of COVID, but also in terms of who are the other people who are out there who really don't agree with any of this and for whom there is absolutely no compromise. Chapter 4 is the Anthropocene blowing your mind, is my way of looking at this question of the Anthropocene and how it changes our psyches. By the way, all the artwork here is my son, Jake 7, who lives in Hobart, Tasmania. This is a painting that he did in Cambridge, Massachusetts when he was visiting that depicts Boston in an era of climate change. And you'll see more of his work as we proceed. This is a wonderful Roz Chast cartoon. And I like those windows, but essentially what she's doing is this is almost like a future archaeology of the planet Earth. If you were to look at who we are and what we do many, many years into the future, what are the things that you would find? But there's another reason why I have this photo as well. This chapter starts where I take you into my office and into my computer, and I realize that I've been in a rabbit hole of the internet, and I've been captured by it and looking more deeply and deeply and deeply into this rabbit hole, which sometimes takes you in places that you had no intention of going. And so I look away for a moment into my office, which you see on below that, and I realize that every one of those books is a portal, just like the internet is a portal. Every frame, the window is a portal. And then I go outside and everything opens up. I'm once again alive, and I'm breathing, and I'm seeing what surrounds me. And so I start the chapter by going through this sequence because it's so familiar to so many of us, walking through the streets of the city, looking at your iPhone, buried in the icons on it, limiting your scope so severely and negating the big outside world that's part of it. So one of the things that I focus on in this chapter is how to set limits to all of this. And I'll get to that in just a moment. But I want to say a little bit about this notion of the Anthropocene. It was a term coined by geologists to suggest the severity of the human impact on the planet, and to say that the severity has been so extraordinary that it qualifies as a unique geological era. Now, that's a contested concept, and there's a lot of academic discussion about it, which I certainly won't go into. I talk a little bit about in the book. But the way I see the Anthropocene, it's the acceleration of two mutually conducive trends. One is the global extraction of natural resources, and the second is the intensity of electronic connectivity. These things are mutually reinforcing. And so what we have is a dynamic perceptual reconditioning of human perceptual awareness. And the question that I ask is, how do we reclaim autonomy in a time of global transformation? And that's what I cover in this chapter. And I do think that perhaps with sufficient reflection, this could be a time of human awakening. The Anthropocene, more of Jake's work on a beach in Tasmania, the idea of the Anthropocene really is human awareness looking back upon itself and not always being so happy with what it's seen. So I recommend what I call the deliberate pause. And those are moments of reflection that you create during the course of a day, so you can once again reintroduce yourself to the natural world and to the biosphere. So those, in brief, again, I'm covering a tremendous amount of ground here, but I want to give you a portrait of what's covered in this book. So hopefully you'll go and read it and spend some time with it. The fifth chapter is called Constructive Connectivity, because I'm fascinated by networks, both ecological and social networks. And my concern is that we all talk about networks, but networks are not taught. You'd be hard pressed to find an elementary or middle or high school classroom, or even a college classroom, where people actually study and teach how you can use networks to your advantage, and some of the dangers of networks as well. This is the golden spike. Cindy and I were traveling cross country. Cindy's my wife, from Seattle back to New Hampshire. And I really wanted to go to Promontory, Utah, so I could see the place where East and West connected. And the golden spike was very meaningful because conceptually, the Transcontinental Railroad laid the way for the internet. If you think about a few little spurs of a railroad in the East and then a few in the West, and eventually they all come together. And when they do come together, the flow of goods can move very, very quickly. The flow of ideas can move very, very quickly. There's the telegraph. So all this, the messages and communication happens. By the way, just a side note, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad was filled with bankruptcies, money laundering schemes, and all types of shenanigans, as well as the utilization of exploited labor. It's a very interesting story for anyone who wants to look into it, and tells you a lot about the dark side of American history. So what I do in this chapter is I spend time looking at the notion of ecological networks, and then I look at social networks and ask how we might juxtapose them. So ecological networks, for example, here we have dendritic drainages, which is a geomorphological way of looking at water flow and study on the left. And on the right, those are tree roots, and below that are mycelium. You take a walk through the forest and there are levels of connectivity that are absolutely astounding that we're first beginning to get small glimpses of. Here's the fascinating networks of seabirds on the Pacific Ocean and where they go and where they spread their seeds and where they breed, where they spend the winter and where they spend the summer and how they navigate. The left is a topological analysis of mycelial tree networks in several forests. And on the right, you can see more visual interpretations of this. The point is, everything is connected all the time. And for the most part, we're just not privy to any of it. More ecological network diagrams. By the way, ecological network research is one of the growing fields of ecological research more generally. And then there are social networks. Here are some diagrams that discuss different ways of thinking about social networks. But these are very interesting and important to know about as well, because one of the challenges is that most people tend to be homophilic in their network relationships. And what that means is they mostly associated with like-minded people. But we know from all kinds of sociological study that the most innovative organizations and the most innovative people are people who can connect different networks. Maybe you're that person. People who never are entirely comfortable in one network or another, but somehow can manipulate between them and can find means of convergence. So one of the things that I think ought to be taught is what are nodes in ecological networks and what are nodes in social networks? And how do we use ecological networks as a template for understanding how social networks can be more constructive? Hence the name of the chapter is Constructive Connectivity. I just found this slide this morning. I took a screenshot. I put social network diagrams into Google Images, and this is what came out. So these are all the different ways of thinking about social networks. An activity that I do, and I talk about it more in the book, and I'll get to that again later, is I've done some consulting at various institutions where I ask people to draw network maps of their organizations, and it's really revealing what they find out. I won't get into that in too much depth now, though. To me, the seminal issue of our generation and probably the next 3 or 4 decades is the problem of migration, the challenge of migration, I should say. The arrival and departure of both people and species. There are extraordinary number of people who are displaced, both between countries as a result of climate catastrophes, which could be floods, it could be wildfires, it could be a variety of things, or earthquakes, and political catastrophes. These kinds of photos are going to become more and more common in years to come. The important thing to note, and I spent a lot of time on this in the book, is that migration is a phenomenon of the biosphere. It's a phenomenon of evolutionary ecology, and it's a phenomenon of human dispersal over a very short period of time. And if you look at the flows of people on any kind of map, you see a very dynamic planet with people moving and going back and forth. The idea of restricting that, although there might be some reason to have some restrictions sometimes, but the idea of restricting it makes no sense whatsoever to me from an ecological point of view. The global journey of humans is remarkable, actually, and when you think about how quickly we settled the entire planet. This is a map that depicts all the walls that have been built recently in the world. Most prominently, of course, is the US-Mexican wall, but there are a lot of walls. And what's the reason and purpose for these walls is to keep people out. It also, by the way, has a huge impact on natural history. But the fact of the matter is walls never work. And the reason why is because it's just a very small boundary in a very big biosphere. Here are some pictures of walls around the world. The upper left is the US-Mexico border in Arizona. The upper right is the Hungary-Serbian border. The lower left, of course, is the Great Wall of China, which was built, walls are not new. And on the bottom right is a wall that separates Iraq and Kuwait. This is a huge challenge for us to think about, and I wanted to present that side of this issue. I'm not going to go into this diagram in depth, but basically this looks at the challenge of not only external displacements, but internal displacements. That is, people within a country who are forced to leave their homes for one reason or another. We've experienced a lot of this in the States as a result of various hurricanes in the South, as a result of wildfires. this is going to get worse as time goes on. So we have to think about how we deal with people who move from one place to another, because you never know when it might be you. So despite all of the walls, here's a stylized diagram that shows the incredible movement of people between places. Now, of course, because of COVID, this has really slowed down. But prior to COVID, if you look at this, it's not just between North America and Mexico. It's between every place and every place. There are dynamic movements of people. And so this is the globe that we live in. And it is both a ecological and a political challenge for us to think about it. Really, if you want to go back far back in time, continents themselves move all the time. Everything moves on the planet. Here's a map that shows you mammals, birds, and amphibians and the travels that they take throughout North America. And of course, there are all kinds of maps that show you what the result of climate change will do to this, or various habitats. Harry Green, I know you're here, and I never forget, you and I were driving together from the airport in Phoenix up to Prescott, and you were looking at a parking lot that was put in, and said that one of the things that you always think about is what happens to all the displaced species when that pavement is put there. And I'll never forget that conversation, and it really influenced me in thinking about this book. Here is an interesting diagram on the left. It's a projected portrait of how tree geography, biogeography will change over a 150-year period of time. And on the right, you see the migratory paths of the monarch butterfly. So this is whales and their breeding areas. Languages move also. This is an incredible map that shows all the dialects of North America superimposed on indigenous languages. Well, how is it that we have all these dialects? It's because people move from one place to another, and then they speak differently, and then they move to another place, and people adapt all these changes. So I encourage you to really look into this question of migration. You can learn a lot about a community based on how it treats outsiders. And I'll get to that when I talk about the next chapter. Here are some really interesting and important books that you might want to look at. Sonia Shaw's great book, The Next Great Migration, looks at the relationship between racism and migration. Isabel Wilkerson, who just wrote the great book Caste, In the Warmth of Other Suns, talks about America's great migration from the South to North among African Americans. And then the National Geographic recently did a special issue called The World on the Move. My book, by the way, refers to all of this, as well as some really fantastic websites. There's so much activity, there's so much activism around these questions right now. It is, as far as I am concerned, the most critical environmental and political question of our times. And it really deserves all the attention we can possibly put on it. And as I suggest, natural history and the biosphere and how we think about human-nature relations should inform how we think about migration issues. Cosmopolitan culture is part of chapter 6, which is actually called Cosmopolitan Bioregionalism. I'll say more about that in a moment. And one of the things I want to point out here is that there are so many heroes around the world who are doing incredible things in so many different habitats. And I wish we could learn more about them. I'm so fed up with hearing about polarization in America and all the challenges that we face in relationship to politics and democracy. I wish any of these news stations would spend at least half an hour every news show talking about people who are doing remarkable things around the world, because there are many of them and they're all over the place. America was originally quite a cosmopolitan place. These are all the indigenous groups and languages that were here prior to European settlement. And of course, it was a remarkably diverse place in terms of habitat. This is a map of New England where I live, and it shows you the incredible variety of types of places. So the fact is, whether it's diversity of landscape, diversity of peoples, the planet is a cosmological place. A wonderful map. The idea of bioregionalism is the idea that you should use ecological and geographic categories to determine political relationships. So this is a stylized map that looks at what a future America might look like under this notion of cosmopolitan bioregionalism. But what I want to, I'm going to not cover this slide right now. What I want to say is that a lot of the action for this is taking place in cities. There's a wonderful book called Ecological Urbanism, which again, I can refer to, I refer to in the bibliography. If anyone wants information about it, I can get it to you. That's like a catalog, almost a whole earth catalog of hundreds of incredible projects that are happening in cities all over the world. We need to highlight these. We need to amplify these. Check out the Nature of Cities blog, the Next City blog, and you'll see that all kinds of really great projects are taking place. They're multi-generational, they're multiracial, and it's very, very good to see. I'm going to cover a few more chapters and then I'll be finished. The 8th chapter in the book is called Improvisational Excellence. Improvisation has always been a very important part of my life. I'll get to that more in a moment. And I cover improvisation through music and sound. David Rothenberg has done some wonderful work on that, through the use of language, and also how we think about evolution. So what I'm interested in is how improvisation is an adaptive learning and an approach to thinking about the biosphere that actually mimics the biosphere itself. So here's a collage of various things showing different forms of improvisation. The board game Go, basketball, which has been very important to my life. That's the Rucker tournament. I see Gary Kenyon, you're here. I miss playing ball with you guys, man. And I feel that improvisation, as I say, is a way to emulate what's beautiful about the biosphere, because what it does is it presents situations for us and problems that we have to solve in the moment, on the spot. And we learn a lot of that by perceiving the natural world and noticing all the changes and all the flows. And improvisational learning is a very important way for us to deal with an ever-changing future. And so I look at patterns in nature and how we can learn from patterns in nature. This is a very interesting photograph that I took from the Canadian Geographic website. And some photographs that I took myself, because I'm very interested in turbulence and flow and how you get into flow states in the midst of random processes. I think that needs to be taught as part of natural history education as well. I have a section where I look at the I Ching, which is one of the oldest, really oldest works of wisdom on the planet. And it's a biosphere template where you look at these icons and, well, pictographs, and you look at the wind, fire, earth, heaven, water, mountain, thunder, etc. And these are all placed together in different ways. And one of the things that I propose in the book is an environmental change I Ching. What if you took all of this and turned it into a way to think about how the environment changes and how you mix and match and how you solve problems as a result of it? Finally, the last chapter is perceptual reciprocity, although I'm not going to end with this. There's one other, there's some other comments I want to make. And what I mean by perceptual reciprocity is that I think everything on the planet perceives on some level or another. That doesn't mean that everything is sentient, but I think when you walk through a landscape, you send a message out and that whole landscape knows that you're there. So more of Jake's work that to me is just a wonderful portrait of this notion of perceptual reciprocity. And by the way, I think that art is such an important part of environmental learning and natural history education, because, and I write about this a lot in my other book, Bringing the Biosphere Home, because what art does is it enables you to jump scales. It enables you to move from the present to the past and to the future, from this space to another space. And you can do it very quickly. And I mean all forms of art, music, literature, dance. It's a very important part of natural history education. This is a diagram that came from Wired magazine, and it depicts, on the left, the synapses in the brain under normal circumstances, whatever that is. And on the right, it depicts the synapses when you've taken psilocybin. Now, I'm not advocating the use of psilocybin, but what I am advocating is for environmental learning to figure out ways to open those synapses. Because I know that when I'm in the natural world and I'm not thinking about other things, my synapses are wide open and I'm perceiving things that I ordinarily don't do because my mind is cluttered and busy with all kinds of things it shouldn't be cluttered and busy with. So this, by the way, also comes from the wonderful book by Michael Pollan, How to Change Your Mind. the book is about psychedelic drugs, but I'm interested in how you apply that book to thinking about environmental learning without the drugs. So in the chapter, I go through some of those concepts. And I'm very interested in the whole notion of absence and presence, and what it means to be part of a landscape, and also what it means to be a member of an ecological neighborhood. And these are various places I visited for a project in a book I wrote some years ago called Pacific Northwest Changemakers. These are all fascinating ecological neighborhoods, and we all belong to them. So the challenge is, how do we become part of those neighborhoods in terms of the tides of change questions that I asked earlier? On the upper left is Garden City Harvest in Missoula, Montana, that does some fantastic work with hunger and farming and social dislocation. On the right is the Centerpole Project at the Crow Nation in South Dakota. They're doing fantastic work with traditional arts and traditional farming. And then on the lower left in inner city Portland is the Cully neighborhood, where they're doing regenerative agriculture. They're rebuilding toxic waste sites and turning them into parks. This is happening all over the globe, and we don't hear enough about it. Finally, the last section here is the second chapter in the book, and it's called Memory Forever Unfolding. Because one of the things I found writing the book in my late 60s, I'm 70 now, is that, gosh, I have a whole lifetime of these memories that are really important. And I'm interested in the relationship between adaptive learning, which I've really spoken about. How do we find a path through the changing flows and circumstances of our social and technological encounters, and blending that with perennial learning, and that is the awareness of the wisdom of the ages. I'm always moved by Gary Snyder's great line from one of his poems, "This present moment that lives on to become long ago," because it's such a fantastic statement of both geology, natural history, and human legacy. So in the early part of the book, I go through some of my own experiences, and I write the book, by the way, from a very personal perspective. Every chapter starts with a personal experience, and I do that because I want it to be a model for you doing the same thing for yourself. How do you start from your personal experiences and then generate ideas that flow from that? And I think that's the best way to teach as well. So for me, one of the most important books that I read in my early childhood, because it taught me about improvisation, was Harold and the Purple Crayon. I loved that book. I first read it when I was 4 or 5 years old. Harold falls asleep and he starts roaming through the whatever, and he starts drawing wherever he goes. And when he gets into trouble, when he gets into danger, he draws his way out. It's the ultimate improvisational learning. And then finally, he gets very worried because he can't find his home, and he can't differentiate all the windows and all the high rises in the city where he lives. And then he remembers that there was a half moon in the window just outside his bed. So he draws the half moon, and then he draws his bed. And to me, this is the ultimate sense of place story, where you start from your home place, and then you have the courage to travel out, and you improvise, and then you finally come home again. And the other major point I want to make in this chapter is the importance of wonder. My parents took me to the Hayden Planetarium when I was very little. I was reading at a young age, and one of the first books I had was The Golden Guide to the Stars. And although I didn't understand a lot of what was in it, I'd flip through those pages. And, in my own young childhood mind, it taught me about infinity, and it taught me about wonder. And also, it also gave me a sense at that age of existential dread. What is my place in all of this? And what does any of this mean? But there's a dark side to these memories too. We used to have the fog man come through suburban Woodmere, Long Island, spreading DDT, and we'd all run through it. And I did it once or twice, and then I started getting headaches, and I stopped doing it. And I've had some issues, body issues, that had to be dealt with. And I always wonder whether they were spawned by this, or who knows what they were spawned by. And it's interesting, I gave a talk at New York University to about 15 graduate students from all over the world and the American South, mostly women of color. And I told them they read this chapter, and every single person in that room had a toxic memory that they could remember from an ecological pollution point of view. And they also had other more joyous memories. So that's why I make that trip into the world of memory. And finally, the book is filled with all kinds of educational activities. A lot of them focus on mapping migration, mapping networks. But because I am a teacher, and whether you use it in a teaching environment or just use them for yourselves, here's a list of all the activities that are in the book. And this is the ultimate sense of place map. I took this photo in Hobart, Tasmania, Australia. And what they did was they asked people who were from Hobart originally and now living all over the world to do a little part of what would become a large map of their sense of place. And so I thought that was very beautiful. Now, for my very last thing, I want to read to you, to very quickly locate it, the very last paragraph in this book, because I think it speaks to who you are and what I hope happens. Perhaps the best way to enhance environmental learning is to spend time with the extraordinary people who devote their lives to these expressions of generosity. You will find them everywhere, in cities and the most remote countrysides, in the diverse habitats and ecosystems of the earth, representing every conceivable age group and ethnicity. They are working on sustainable solutions, anti-poverty strategies, urban ecologies, human and ecosystem health, intercultural understanding, peace and justice, gender equality, LGBTQ issues, animal welfare, and wilderness preservation. You could make a list of good causes and organizations as long as this book, and you could enter their names in a field guide to human generosity that will entail volumes more. These are the heroes of our times, and they are working together against formidable challenges to understand the tides of change and promote solutions filled with kindness, compassion, empowerment, and generosity. They are the contemporary capstone of planetary environmental learning. They live in your neighborhood. They work on these projects every day. They have been doing so for generations, and they are most probably you. I'll leave this slide up for now because this tells you how you can get in touch with me. This is from my website. I really encourage you to get in touch with me. I love getting email correspondence, especially in the time of COVID. I am doing as many virtual presentations as I can for no charge. So if you want to use me, in some capacity, please do. I enjoy it enormously, and I'm happy to chat with anyone about anything, anytime. So please do get in touch with me. What my website will tell you how. And that's it for now, Tom Fleischner.
Thank you. We can all catch our breath now. Catch your breath. That was phenomenal, and thank you so much. Yeah, Sue Ellen says the same, that she loved how much you packed into it. We were concerned we were having a problem with that the Q&A function seemed like it wasn't working quite right. So we just reopened the chat function. So you can, if you have a question or a comment, you can put it either place, and I'll be swinging back and forth to track those and sort of feed them to Mitch. But maybe to start, while people are adding some questions from the group, Mitch, I wanted to ask you about one particular thing that the subtitle of the book, and part of the title of the talk tonight from that is A New Vision for Environmental Learning. And you're known as an educator, environmental educator, and you have you make a point near the beginning of the book that part of the reason for that you chose that is that the term environmental education has been sort of marginalized. And I just would love to hear you talk just a little bit about that decision to use the phrase environmental learning as opposed to education. And is it possible, like how much power does that have to the substitution of different language? Does that open us up in different kind of ways, or just would love to hear a little bit about that particular choice that you made?
Yeah, well, I think honestly, Tom, you're thinking about it a little bit more deeply than I did. I've been worried for a long time that environmental education is trivialized. People hear the word and they run for the hills, or they stereotype you as, oh, you're all about bugs and bunnies. Oh, you're this is who you are. This is what you think about. And I don't think that's the fault of environmental educators. I think that's been the fault, honestly, of a disinformation campaign that's gone on, that's been very well funded, and that's gone on for quite some time. It's a disinformation campaign, by the way, that was successful enough that it provided quite a bit of impetus for future disinformation campaigns. So so I didn't want to use that term. And then I used the term environmental learning, because learning is who we are and that's what we do. And in order to know the world, you have to learn about the world. So I just thought it was a broader term. You know, whether there's any inherent power in it, I have no idea. But I thought the word may be a bit more challenging and, you know, might spawn some conversations like this. But that was the motivation behind it.
Great, great. Thank you. Several people making comments basically thanking you, and John Calderazzo, for example, bravo, Book of Wonders and Guide to Action rolled into one. Thanks for thinking so long and hard about many of these issues, especially migration. And yeah, several thank yous. But and then a couple, several questions here. So from Glenn Copeland here in Prescott, he asks if you have an opening comment or challenge statement to break the ice and boundaries, oops, it just popped around, of a victim of the past that sees all of his world as a miserable experience. And he says, you don't need to take too much time, but he'd love to explore this with you.
Yeah, that's almost a therapeutic question. And it really depends on the circumstances. I know we've all been in teaching situations where a lot of pain gets expressed. And I think sometimes it's very hard to distinguish between an individual's therapeutic pain and the pain, let's say, of systemic racism. It takes a lot of skill to really find a way to move that distinction through a group so that you can get somewhere. So I wouldn't say I have any special skill in doing so, other than the common sense of listening well and giving people the space and freedom and trust and respect to be able to express themselves in a safe environment. But that takes time. You typically don't want to open any kind of educational session with that. But as trust gets built, I mean, I've taught a lot of classes where, over a couple of days, let's say, or a couple of weeks, depending on whether it's weekly or daily, you sometimes get into some very difficult places. But usually at that point, people have enough trust in each other or enough trust in me that they're willing to go there. And I take that as a good sign, that they're willing to open up. So just a few thoughts about that. I think there are people way more experienced in dealing with it than I am. But those are my 2 cents.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Let's see, several things. Nancy Menning says, you speak of the internet, books, and the natural world outside our windows as portals of experience. To what extent are other people, especially other people in your local community, essential touchstones for an individual's environmental learning? Are they portals, collaborators, part of the network?
Yeah, there are crucial parts of the network. That's why I concluded with that comment about your ecological neighborhood. Who are the other species and are the other people, the more than human and the humans who are your close neighbors, and how do you work together with them? That's super important. Sometimes you can connect via the internet, and that's okay. That's all we have right now, which has been incredibly challenging. I cannot tell you how much I just miss ambient social contacts, let alone hugging friends. It's been very, very difficult. We learn about ourselves through others. That's the whole book is based on. I say over and over again in the book, the importance of working with groups of people, to think about these questions and think about these ideas. It's not enough to do it by yourself, ever. And there are moments of reflection, and there are moments of meditation, of course. And there are moments of solitude, of course. But environmental learning takes place in community as well. And if we're going to have an impact and make a difference in other people's lives and in our own lives, you know, as I, again, my geriatric comment, as I am about to turn 71, and as I watch elders who are living flourishing lives, the people who live the most flourishing lives are those who are in service to community. You know, we all have to find a way to emulate them. And it's not just for people in, you know, my age group, it's for people in all age groups. I feel so much sorrow for kids in school right now. Our 8-year-old granddaughter cries every night. You know, she loves her family, she loves her sister, she loves her mom and dad, but she doesn't have any friends to hang out with. So, you know, this is really painful for all of us. And you touched on that with your great question.
Great. Let's see, couple accolades here and then a couple questions. Bonnie Pace Duncanson says, wonderful presentation. You and Robin Wall Kimmerer are spot on. That's great. Our mutual friend Sarah Rabkin says, thank you, Mitch. Lucid, cogent, stimulating, energizing, a grand illumination of the very big picture that connects richly with what's up close right here, right now. You're already helping me think anew and with fresh energy about so many questions and challenges that preoccupy me. I need to read the book. And so we encourage everybody to do that. And again, remember, one of our co-sponsors, the peregrineBookCompany.com, is one of the places you can get it. Let's see. Whoops, things are popping around on my screen. Laird Christensen says, your essay on cosmopolitan bioregionalism is coming up in his graduate course, Ecology, Culture, and Community. He's glad to see you return to the topic in this book and is wondering if you address the privilege or accessibility of bioregional consciousness in an age where displacement will become more and more the norm.
Yeah, I think that's woven throughout. It's woven throughout all my work. There's a chapter in Bringing the Biosphere Home called Transience and Permanence Forever Unfolding, where I look at my own diasporan tradition as a European Jew, and I look at other diasporan traditions around the world. So that's been a very important theme. How do you feel fidelity to a place, whether you're there for a day or for, you know, 1,000 years? So yeah, I do look at that. I look at the issue of borders and boundaries and what that means, and what is a political border and what's an ecological border. Laird, bring me into your class. I'd love to, you know, come and chat for a while if you're interested.
There's an offer you can't refuse, Laird. Let's see, several things here. Jacob Lewis says, when connecting with young people, and it clarifies it means teenagers, not younger children, to natural history and environmental awareness, a sense of what's the point can be dangerously close at hand, either because it seems too huge a problem or too far away. What is the function of loss and of grieving in a new environmental learner?
It's a really great question, Jake. You know, I was supposed to come and do some work for you guys. Then COVID interrupted all that. I deal with that question, not so much in this book. I deal with it in a previous book called Bring the Biosphere Home, where I have a chapter called Keeping Global Change in Mind. And I look at some of the existential challenges that are inherent in this work, the relationship between creation and extinction, the relationship between wonder and indifference, the relationship between hope and foreboding. I don't think that, look, there's just a sense of existential dread that we all experience. You know, anyone who grew up in the atomic era, I used to listen to sirens in the 1960s, and I'd always think, uh-oh, is this it? And I turned the radio on to make sure that people were still talking. You know, that's how I grew up, and because of, you know, the nuclear arms race. So the existential dread issue, I mean, every generation faces it in its own way. So I don't think you can avoid it entirely, but it's like the other question of the amount of pain and you can deal with in a teaching setting. You have to be judicious and you have to be contextual. You have to figure out who the students are and what they're capable of, and what you're capable of. And you always have to balance a sense of wonder with the real challenges that people face. Because if you only focus on the challenges or the doom, then you're becoming a victim yourself. There's a kind of cheap victimization we easily fall into and degenerate. with these conversations. And but how do you move out of that into action? That's the issue. And I think, again, who are the exemplars of action? Who are the people? I mean, who are the people in the age group? Who are the teenagers? Whether it's Greta Thunberg or whomever. I mean, she's the one who's gotten most famous, but there are hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of teenagers around the world who are doing remarkable things, and you point them out, you Skype them in.
Yeah, if I might just add something to that, it seems like as far as that thing about natural history and environmental awareness, that some of it I think is a bit of a sequencing issue. And I think one of the things we see here is that the role of natural history is that really I sometimes call a practice of falling in love with the world, and it's if there's a single failure, I think that is in my mind happened in environmental education over the decades. It's that focusing too much on what's wrong with the world at too young of an age, and so loving the world is part of the thing that then sort of buffers the grieving as well.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, we got several things here. Harry Green says, as an ecologist, I think of reciprocity primarily in terms of interactions and relationships like predator-prey, competition, mutualism, scavengers and detritivores, and so forth. You focused instead on perceptual reciprocity between humans and other species, and especially concerning the likes of trees and rocks. And he wonders if you could elaborate on what the latter means and why you ended up with that emphasis. Thank you.
Harry, this also brings me back to our conversation, because we talked about the distinction between sentience and reciprocity. And I don't know if you remember that conversation, but I do. And it guided me away from the notion of sentience, actually. And it guided me into the idea of perception, because it struck me that the levels of perceptual learning among species are quite profound, and that we really don't know that much about them. I was really struck in reading about mycelium, how little research has been done on mycelium networks and how they transport information, chemicals, and how vital they are for the health of the forest. So I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. When you look at soil microorganisms and you look at the decomposition that takes place in the soil, and you look at the different levels and strands and networks of communication, we're just like infants beginning to grasp it for the first time. But I think there are. I don't know if I'm getting at your question. In fact, your question may even be over my head, because it brings an awareness and a knowledge of natural history and ecological relationships that I just don't have.
You're gonna have to get us all together again.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, well, this is great. I've got two other questions here that have been here for a bit, and I think probably after that we'll have to sort of wrap things up here, because I know it's getting late back east. So this is from Doug Luke. He said he loved seeing you make the connection between social networks and ecological networks. And he just read a column in the Atlantic suggesting that COVID is breaking our social, quote, weak ties, which might have long-term consequences. COVID may be leaving permanently altered social, health, and political systems. Do you think that there may be some unexpected opportunities for new and or radical environmental change post-COVID because of this?
Well, Doug, that's a great question, and it is really great to hear from you. And we have to connect again. It's been a long time. Doug does a lot of work on social learning and social networks in relationship to epidemiology in a variety of ways. I think that there is a risk on the one hand that, by the way, so-called weak ties are ties that. It's a funny term, because in social network theory, weak ties are actually the relationships between two homophilic networks that connect those networks. So why is that a weak tie and not a strong tie? I don't know. So in fact, I cover this in the book, and it's a term I don't really like very much. Yeah, I think that's a real risk right now. I mean, because of COVID and because of the constriction of networks, we're much more likely to hang out with like-minded folks. But having said all that, I feel that when COVID is at least managed in such a way that we can have more communication again, there's going to be a jubilee period of sorts. I'm feeling that way. I think it's going to be a celebratory time. I really feel that so many people have realized the importance of the social relationships, whether ambient or intimate, that they've so long taken for granted. We're hungry for that kind of visceral relationship now. We really are. And I think we can use that to promote more change, more environmental change, but all kinds of change. I mean, one of the things that's been so wonderful about the Biden administration thus far, I mean, you couldn't have asked for more in terms of the appointments that focus on climate justice. I mean, it's just amazing, really. I mean, we're basically seeing a Green New Deal, but that's not what they're calling it. So what that does to me is it says it provides opportunities for people to go to work with each other. So what we're doing right now is he's creating a template. We're all creating a template, and we can fill in that template when we can actually get together again. Now, I try to be optimistic about things because what other choice do we have?
Great. Thank you. Okay, I said only one more, but I'm going to squeeze in two. So John Calderazzo, hey John, he says, your talk makes me think that in the case of young folks especially, an insightful activity for them might be to look at a childhood experience with nature and then every 5 or so years look at it again through the ever-evolving lens of growing older, learning more, and the frameworks that history and politics provide us. I submit this in the spirit of knowing that nonfiction memoir offers excellent examples of this. When you look back at something that happened when you were 10, the way you might you see might change hugely when you're age 15, when looking back, and then 25, and so on.
Yeah, you know, that's a great idea. It's a very interesting. If you know, we have these long-term environmental change research projects that qualifies as one personal narrative and memoir in relationship to long-term environmental change. I actually write about this in a previous book, Bring the Biosphere Home, where I say one of the best ways to understand environmental change is to go back to your childhood place and experience it today. So, you know, you and I are both from the South Shore of Long Island, and it's been a long time since I've been there. But, you know, if you go back now and remember what it was like in your childhood and go back now and look at it, it has really changed substantially. I mean, we've been around a long time. It's been 60 years or so in some cases. So I think that's a very interesting way of doing things too. Go back to a place that you haven't been to for a long time, where you still have an idea, an image in your head of what it looks like, and see how it's been irrevocably changed and what that's done to the place and what that means for you. That's a great idea though, John. And there are so many ways it can be done in a variety of educational settings.
Okay. Okay, my friend Richard Neville says he would love to hear your thoughts on how you guide profoundly environmentally woke students toward the ways that they might find their own ways to have the most meaningful impact on ecological caring for the world.
And then he has Tikkun Olam.
Yeah.
Nice to see that, Richard. You know, I hate to constantly refer back to previous books I wrote, but I guess I'm allowed to do that. There are 4 of them now. And I write about this a lot in my first book, Ecological Identity. And I think everyone has a different voice for how they express themselves in public. There are some people who are activists and they're very comfortable doing that. And for others, they just can't ever conceive of themselves in a role like that. And there might be other ways that they have huge impacts on the world. So I think the way you guide students is to help them understand their voice and their contribution. And often they need guidance that way. You know, very often people don't even know what their strengths are. And the role of the teacher is to help the student bring those strengths out and let them know that she or he has those strengths, and then to use them appropriately. So that's the way I look at it. You know, who is the person, and what do they bring, and what can they contribute? And when can they realize what that contribution might be?
Great. Thank you. And I appreciate the comment from LP Co that don't end it on account of them on the East Coast. I think we don't have any other outstanding questions except several other thanks. Mercedes says beautifully expressed. I think maybe we're at a good spot. That seems like a good place to close. So with that, I think we will say thank you again, Mitch, for this wonderful, energetic, and deeply thoughtful presentation. It's great to be here with you again tonight. And again, want to encourage everybody to get the book. And our co-sponsor, the Peregrine Book Company, peregrinebookcompany.com is one place that you can get it wherever you are. And again, we welcome you into our community at the Natural History Institute, invite you to our website as a portal into many of our programs, naturalhistoryinstitute.org. We have a lot of other great programs coming up soon. So again, thank you all of us for making time with us this evening. Thank you again, Mitch. It's been great. Great evening. And again, this program will be archived on our YouTube channel by this time tomorrow. It'll actually be there right almost immediately, but a cleaned up version will take about 24 hours to get up. And thanks again to my colleague Bob Ellis behind the scenes with the tech part, and we will call it a night. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Tom.
Hasta luego.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Take care.